Good morning. Welcome to everyone. A discriminatory comment, a special welcome to those who've come from far distances, people from far abroad. I somehow feel like I should welcome you extra, as opposed to those of us who live in South Bend and only have to, roll out of bed as usual to be here at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. My name is Brad Gregory. I'm the director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, and there is feedback. Let's hope that works. It's my pleasure to chair this first session of our NDIAS Templeton Colloquium devoted to David Bentley Hart's project on the character and implications of human consciousness. Before we begin this opening session, I'd like to express the Institute's gratitude to the John Templeton Foundation. Their generosity in the form of a grant to the NDIAS has made possible this Templeton Colloquium at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. Biographies of our presenters and moderators are available both online as part of the Colloquium webpage on the NDIAS website, and paper copies, as I'm sure many of you noticed, are available just outside the room where we're meeting here today as well. A few introductory words before we get started. This colloquium was conceived by David Bentley Hart, one of this year's Templeton Fellows at the NDIAS. His goal was to bring together scholars from multiple disciplines and fields to examine questions related to consciousness, including whether consciousness can evolve or emerge from matter, intentionality and the transcendental ends of consciousness, the classic metaphysics of the soul, Eastern contributions to the understanding of consciousness, and the relationship between the soul and the whole of being. The overarching goal for these 2 days is to promote a lively, open, and wide-ranging discussion among the colloquium presenters, the moderators, and members of the audience. The caliber of the invited presenters, who will be responding to an initial essay written in advance and distributed by Professor Hart, testifies both to the compelling, ambitious topic and to his intellectual reputation. The first session will have 2 parts as follows. First, Professor Hart will offer an introduction and orientation to the topic as a whole, framing his questions and articulating goals for the colloquium in relationship to his major ongoing project on the character of human consciousness. Second, after he is finished, I will open the floor initially to questions, and then Professor Hart will field his own comments and questions from the audience. This colloquium is also, I should mention, being broadcast via live streaming video, and those watching in that form may also submit questions via the Institute's website or email address. One further note, because I also get paid to teach here at Notre Dame and have to do so at 10:30, I will be leaving this particular session while it's still going on at about 10:15 at the latest, and I just want to assure that whoever may have asked the last question or made the last comment, my getting up and leaving has nothing to do with an objection or my assessment or opinion about the question or comment that you might raise, or for that matter, how David might have responded to the last question. It's my pleasure now to introduce David Bentley Hart. As many, if not all of you know, David Hart is one of the world's most distinguished Anglophone theologians with wide-ranging expertise in philosophical theology, systematic theology, patristics, classical and continental philosophy, and Asian religions. The recent holder of the Danforth Chair at St. Louis University, he is currently a Templeton Fellow at the NDIAS. His most recent work focuses on the genealogy of classical and Christian metaphysics, ontology, the metaphysics of the soul, and the philosophy of mind. The author of multiple books and more than 150 articles, his best-known works include The Beauty of the Infinite, 2003, The Doors of the Sea, 2005, Atheist Delusions, 2009, and The Experience of God in 2013. In addition to multiple other prestigious fellowships and awards, in 2011, Professor Hart was awarded the Michael Ramsey Prize of the Church of England. Please join me in welcoming David Bentley Hart.
Thanks for that. I hope no one will take it amiss if I sit to speak for health reasons. It's Not that I'm casual by nature, but as a rule, it's wiser for me not to stand to speak for any length of time. Thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks especially to all the scholars who accepted the invitation, some of whom I was sure wouldn't have the opportunity, wouldn't be able to make it, and yet they all came. And now I feel somewhat humbled, since I'm surrounded by persons I genuinely want to impress. On the other hand, as the at least titular organizer of the conference, it is sort of like being the manager of the 27 Yankees. Hand in the lineup card and take a nap. So let me start with a passage from an extremely important philosopher as regards this topic, Flann O'Brien. I won't attempt the Irish accent because there are just too many persons in the room who would be offended by my attempts. Who had uttered these words? They had not frightened me, they were clearly audible to me, yet I knew they did not ring out across the air. They came from deep inside me, from my soul. Never before had I believed or suspected I had a soul, but just then I knew I had. I knew also that my soul was friendly, was my senior in years, and was solely concerned for my own welfare. For convenience, I called him Joe. I felt a little reassured to know that I was not altogether alone. Joe was helping me. Now, I want, I think, to, at least in the long run, to endorse these insights. At least I want to suggest that while we may not suspect that the soul is there, deep within, or at the ground, or behind the veil of ordinary consciousness, it most certainly is. I want also to insist that there's a sense in which it is older than, much older, and in another sense, at least logically prior to, the empirical or psychological self that is the subject of ordinary experience, that seems to persist over the course of a life in a constant state of becoming, and that nevertheless paradoxically senses itself as a discrete identity. Indeed, I want to claim, but for that essential priority of the soul, the experience of consciousness is ultimately unintelligible. And of course, I want to argue the necessity of calling that reality Joe. But all of that lies at the end of a long argument. And here today, as in the book I'm writing, I want to start from less ambitious claims. My project, which I'm not presuming to impose on the conference participants, I'm just hoping will be enormously enriched by what I learned from them, begins as a fairly fastidious, critical, and phenomenological investigation of what can be said about the reality of mind, or whether it is reducible to physical causes, which I frankly believe to be impossible. What constitutes consciousness as an act? From there, I'll move in fairly small but relentless steps towards certain metaphysical conclusions, many of which, perhaps all of which, conform to classical pictures, both Western and Eastern, of the soul, and of, to risk an indiscretion and mention it right up front, the God of classical theism. But again, that's the end, and we're at the beginning, so I just want to make some preliminary observations this morning to set the scene, historically, of current thinking about mind and its relation to the physical order, and to gesture towards some of the perplexities that emerge from the assumptions we share as modern persons when we attempt to frame a picture of that relation for ourselves. But I'm not going to try to be exhausted. I will say this, to anyone whose knowledge of philosophical and religious intellectual history extends back further than 3 or 4 centuries, what seems most curious about current philosophical and even scientific debates regarding the mind or soul or consciousness is the frequent poverty of conceptual range they exhibit. As inheritors of a picture of reality shaped by the mechanistic metaphysics of early modernity, we today are confronted by a preposterous dilemma when we attempt to make sense of the reality of intentional consciousness. Within the mechanical narrative, matter is mindless mass, physical causality, mindless force, and so the causal power of, say, conceptual abstractions or volitions or final purposes creates a considerable theoretical problem, one that seems to allow, in modern terms, for only 2 possible solutions, either some version of Cartesian dualism, in which the body is a machine operated by an immaterial homunculus called the soul, or a thoroughgoing mechanical monism in which mind and soul or soul rather, is an emergent result or epiphenomenon of unguided physical events. And between the high, grim escarpments of these two options, there lies only a very narrow pass. And trapped as many materialist philosophers are, or neuroscientists are in this defile, they naturally assume that if they can only dispose of the Cartesian soul once and for all, they will have by default established the supremacy of the physicalist position. And all now also naturally assume that to chase that fabulous and anxiously alert little imp away, they need only find a sufficient number of instances in which the brain operates without immediate conscious supervision on the part of any purely cognizant rational agency within, moments, that is, when the homunculus appears to be asleep at the controls. For then they will have proved that everything, mind included, is only a form of mechanism after all. And a great many conceptually confused experiments have been conducted over the past few decades for just this purpose. And there's a certain poignancy, I have to say, about the sight of cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind exerting themselves to tear down the Cartesian partition between body and mind in the hope of demonstrating that there really is, after all, no wonderful wizard to be found on the other side pulling the levers. For the mechanistic paradigms within which they operate condemn them to a simple, inescapable choice. If they are not to believe in a ghost mysteriously animating a machine, they must make themselves believe in a machine miraculously generating a ghost. To my mind, the inconvenient problem bedeviling the project is that this reduction of consciousness to mechanical causes is probably both empirically and logically impossible. But again, that's a long argument. But let me start just from consciousness itself as a momentary experience, because in those rare moments that briefly awaken us to the strangeness of things, the utter givenness of the world, we're confronted by two mysteries. No less wonderful than the being of things is our consciousness of them, our ability to know the world, to possess a continuous subjective awareness of reality, to mirror the unity of being in the unity of a private cognizance, to assume each moment of experience into a fuller comprehension of the whole, and to relate ourselves to the world through acts of judgment and will. In a single movement of thought, the mind is capable of receiving the world in both its integrity and diversity, of holding past, present, and future together, of contemplating reality at once under both its particular and its general aspects, of composing endless imaginative and conceptual variations upon experience, of pondering itself as it ponders the outer world, and all the while preserving that limpid presence to itself in which it abides. Being is transparent to mind, mind to being. Each is fitted to the other, open to the other, at once contained and containing the other, contained by and containing the other. To a convinced materialist, all of this must be wholly physical in nature and probably entirely mechanical in the broadest sense. Even if the science as yet eludes us, consciousness must be explicable entirely in terms of the interaction between our neural constitution and the concrete world about us. Of course, even the materialists should be willing to grant that the powers of mind can't be exhaustively accounted for solely in terms of the mechanics of sensory stimulus and neurological response, if only because neither stimulus nor response as a purely physical interaction is a mental phenomenon possessing conceptual content, intentional meaning, or personal awareness. But the problem from a purely inductive vantage is far greater than that. There's so absolute a qualitative abyss between the objective facts of neurophysiology and the subjective experience of being a conscious self that any method capable of providing a model of the former can hardly produce an adequate causal narrative of the latter. The two sides of the phenomenon simply can't be collapsed into a single observable datum or even connected in a clear causal sequence, and so the precise relation between them can't be defined or even isolated as an object of scientific scrutiny. And no matter how sophisticated our knowledge of the complex activities of the brain may become, will we ever be able to examine from any objective vantage the simple act of thought in its proper aspect, the conscious awareness of a subject. I'll say this at least, in the end there will always remain that essential part of the conscious self that seems simply to stand apart from the spectacle of material causality, pure perspective, a gaze in upon reality that is itself available to no gaze from beyond itself, and known to itself only in its act of knowing what is other than itself. And for a scientific culture that believes true knowledge of anything can be gained only by the systematic reduction of that thing to its simplest parts, undertaken from an entirely third-person stance, this inaccessible first-person subjectivity, this indissoluble interiority, impossible to disassemble, reconstruct, or model, yet full of numberless, incommunicable qualitative sensations and velleities and intuitions into which no inquisitive eye can ever peer, is so radically elusive a phenomenon that there seems no hope of capturing it in any complete scientific account. Now, I don't want to trespass too much upon the area of the next session, but I do want to note that a materialist account of consciousness often seems implausible not merely because of the limits of scientific method. For one thing, absolutely central to a true mechanistic vision, which, to be honest, still tends to dominate in philosophy and mind more than one would expect, the principle, one of the principles that's foremost is that material forces are inherently mindless, intrinsically devoid of purpose, and therefore only adventitiously and accidentally directed towards any end when assumed into composite structures whose essentially disparate parts, as a result of design or chance, operate together in some kind of functional order. And so consciousness would appear to be precisely what the principles of mechanism say matter is not: directed, purposive, essentially rational. Thus, the best materialist interpretation of consciousness is likely to be able to offer, even in the far future, I suspect, will be increasingly precise indices of correlations between mental phenomena and discrete electrochemical events in the cerebral cortex without any real causal narrative to mediate between them. And what that, how any combination of diverse material forces, even when fortuitously gathered into complex neurological systems, could add up to the simplicity and immediacy of consciousness, to its extraordinary openness to the physical world, its reflective awareness of itself, its liberty of conceptual and imaginative power. Well, that will have to remain an enigma explained away by gestures in the direction of mysterious emergent properties generated by the cumulative complexity of the modular brain. And this understanding of emergence, I fear, often is not conspicuously different from a belief in magic, because we're asked to believe that in this instance alone, the essential aimlessness of matter achieves so intense and intricate a concentration of its various random forces that all at once it is fantastically inverted into the virtual opposite of everything modern orthodoxies tell us matter should be. Somewhere a perfect qualitative difference has been conjured away by an accumulation of quantitative complexities. I'm obviously giving some indication of my problems with this project. Consider just some, again, I don't want to trespass on the next session, but some of the classic problems that pose difficulties for materialist reductions of mind. The most commonly invoked is the problem of qualia, that qualitative sense of what it is like that constitutes the immediately intuitive form of subjectivity, and that poses philosophical difficulties that seem to become more insoluble the more vigorously one attempts to account for them in materialist terms. Now, quite often in philosophy of mind, especially Anglophone philosophy of mind, the issue of consciousness is limited to precisely this issue of mental qualia or phenomenal subjectivity, usually under the assumption that if this, the one true hard question, can be satisfactorily resolved, every other question will prove easily amenable to a mechanical or genetic explanation, genetic in the causal sense. And one sees why. Qualia are the purest, most immediate, most inalienable dimension of personal awareness. Even so, from a truly physicalist perspective, no less baffling than qualitative awareness, I think, is the semiotic structure of human thought, which seems impossible to reduce to something like computational algorithms, or the qualitative chasm between the logical sequences of rational thinking and the electrochemical sequences of neurology, or the mind's capacity for abstraction, or the sheer richness of the irreducible abstract concepts by which we experience things and that seem necessarily impossible to derive directly from experience, or the necessarily prior presence of thought's transcendental conditions within every moment of experience, or the unified field of awareness which seems to arise from something like an indivisible simplicity, or perhaps from my work, the most important problem, mental intentionality. And I don't even have a clear sense which of these problems is the most basic or original. But all of that is to come. I just want to note here that for the purposes of my project, at least, I want to place special emphasis upon the apperceptive unity of consciousness and upon the intentional structure of thinking, but we'll get to that tomorrow. I also want to note that one of the things I find most astonishing when I read much of the literature of current philosophy of mind, especially from those theorists who actually propose solutions to them, is how often the most obvious aspect is the one that is most regularly missed. What is often, perhaps inaccurately, called the mind-body problem is not so much solved as rendered invisible, either by inadvertence or by willful blindness. And again, I mean that abiding qualitative difference between an objective, supposedly mechanical, third-person order of physical causes and a subjective, unified, irreducibly intentional first-person realm of experience. Sometimes this chasm is apparently leapt over with disarming ease by the elegant device of a mere grammatical solecism, such as happens when attempts are made to explain consciousness in terms of information theory. The qualitative difference between the objective and the subjective orders is simply avoided by the category error of treating the word information as univocal, whether one is using it as a name for data out there to be perceived or the experience in here of perceiving them. But of course, the usage there is properly, at best, analogous. I'll admit that the currently most popular form of this approach, which is Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, especially as it's promoted by the erstwhile neuroscientific absolutist Christoph Koch, seems tacitly to betray some awareness of the error insofar as it is actually, and this is its beguiling audacity, not a theory of consciousness at all, but only of its mensurability. The entire project presupposes the principle of panpsychism, that consciousness is simply a ubiquitous property of all things physical, an irreducible prime quality of atoms, of coffee spoons, begonias, human beings, stars, everything except Donald Trump. The only question then is the relative complexity with which it may be integrated into complex systems. Now, of course, even to call consciousness a property susceptible of relative amplitudes like weight, color, velocity, rather than as an act with quite special phenomenological contours is probably vacuous. But I have to say that while there are any number of idealist versions of panpsychism that seem coherent to me, as a proposal within a materialist, and especially a mechanical materialist, frame, I find it not only a little absurd, but oddly irrelevant. It simply repeats the problem it pretends to address at an atomic level. We have the same paradox. One and the same atom, say, possesses two contradictory aspects, which are the inversion of one another. Let's be Kantian and call them nomological and pathological. One side of this thing, which is bound by physical laws, is mechanistic and empirical. The other, which is possessed of qualitative awareness, is teleological and transcendental, and the interaction between the two sides is no less mysterious for having been atomized. I feel at this point as if I've passed through the looking glass and am having the critiques of practical reason and of judgment explained to me by Humpty Dumpty. I'm just barely willing to countenance an irresolvable paradox of something being at once an empirical objectivity obedient to mechanistic determinism and also a transcendental subjectivity possessed of intentionality and freedom, but only as applied to myself and other appreciably sentient beings. I'm not able to tolerate it as applied to one's breakfast cereal. If nothing else, how could one ever summon up the moral resolve to lift one's spoon? And I would say the same about many of the most common approaches to the enigma of consciousness and philosophy of mind, models of supervenience, epiphenomenalism, emergent properties, panpsychism, various functionalisms and eliminativisms, computational models of mind, all of which I hope, well, some of which will be discussed in the days ahead. I make bold to say, and we'll hope to argue more so later, do not offer solutions to the problem, but merely restate it, albeit in a way that seems for a time less jarring than the normal starker formulations. And of course, the commonest way of attempting to bridge the abyss between mind and world tends to exhibit a logical error that I've got into the habit in recent years of calling the pleonastic fallacy. The belief that an absolute or infinite qualitative difference can be closed by a sufficiently large number of small quantitative steps. Usually this comes in the form of attempted complex etiologies of consciousness from unconscious material causes, either neurological or phylogenetic. But of course, a structural paradox can't be resolved by a genetic narrative. The problem can at best be deferred to some earlier episode in the tale in the hope that eventually it will disappear from view altogether in the mists of the epic or mythic prehistory of the species, or in the colliginous tangled depths of the brain's ganglial forests. But there are other forms of the same error. Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model of consciousness strikes me as doing the same thing, or attempts to explain reflexive consciousness away as a simple function of cerebral proprioception by a brain module that doubles information flow. And thus, if you follow that, the difficulty of reducing intentional subjective consciousness to brain mechanics is dispelled by positing a smaller brain inside the brain, intending the brain's intentions of the world. But I won't be so indiscreet as to call attention to the infinite regress that inaugurates, if you won't. It must be early in the morning. Usually I'm able to get bigger laughs with these lines. So, anyway, I don't want to anticipate what's to come any more than that. I want simply to remind all of us that before the rest of the colloquium unfolds, I want to remind us that in many ways the most acute problems posed by consciousness are modern problems which we've inherited from the intellectual revolutions of early modernity. Our common sense materialism, and common sense is always a cultural artifact, let us remember, and our instinctive mechanistic metaphysics condemn us to a constant confrontation with paradox where the thinkers of earlier centuries were perhaps confronted only by the mysterious depth of what was otherwise a rationally seamless picture of reality. At least I hope that those who deal with the classical metaphysics of the soul would agree with me that for thinkers of antiquity or the Middle Ages, before body and soul had been divorced from one another, the former reduced to an intrinsically mindless mechanism, the latter to an intrinsically disembodied rational substance, and then forced to work out their differences under terms of settlement dictated them by an unsympathetic metaphysical court. You have custody of sexual desire and you have custody of chess. Certainly, neither Platonists nor Aristotelians nor Stoics nor any of the Christian metaphysicians of late antiquity or the Middle Ages could have conceived of matter as something independent of spirit in the way we can, to which spirit is simply superadded in living beings, or thought of the body or the cosmos as a machine merely organized by adventitious forces. These sorts of generalizations are dangerous, but they, put that in quotation marks, saw matter as being always already informed by indwelling rational causes and thus open to, directed towards mind, nor obviously did Platonists or Aristotelians or Christians conceive of spirit as being immaterial in the privative sense, in the way that a vacuum is not aerial or a vapor not a solid. You could even argue that for the best of these systems, spirit was more substantial, more actual, more supereminently real than matter as we imagine it, the pervasive reality in which matter had to participate to be anything at all. And so the quandaries produced by early modern dualism then, such as the notorious interaction problem, simply did not exist, because no school conceived of the interaction between body and soul as a purely extrinsic physical alliance between two disparate kinds of substance. And I'm going to skip a paragraph there because it'll come up later anyway. But I will say this: for pagans, Hellenistic Jews, and Christians alike, the soul was the source and immanent entelechy of corporeal life for many, encompassing every dimension of human existence: animal functions and abstract intellect, sensation and reason, emotion, ratiocination, flesh and spirit, natural aptitude, and supernatural longing. Thus, there was no explicitly enunciated problem of consciousness in ancient or medieval sources, at least in the way the word is used today, of the sort that seems obvious to us. There was the question of knowledge, how the mind and the being of the world were fitted to one another. But as I say, it's a question rather than a problem, because the issue was how to understand the way in which knowledge is gained, not how it is possible for mind and world to interact at all. And this was because, for many, there were certain fundamental ontological assumptions in place that made this issue no real problem, that the world out there and the mind in here were both, for instance, in their differing modalities informed by the same ideal order. Thus, the form of the tree that actuated the potency of prime matter was out there, to give one system, was the same actuality that activated the mind's fantastic capacity, its perception and idea of the tree. And this is the same even for straightforward illuminationism or an Aristotelian Thomistic epistemology. The whole vision in its fully worked out late antique and medieval forms is sustained within an ontology of participation in that original principle, in which what for us are the two sides of phenomenal consciousness, intentional mind, objective world, flow from the divine simplicity, wherein supereminently they perfectly coincide. Being and consciousness and God are one act, and so in us a natural, rational relation. One is, in knowing the world, involved in some way in that infinite identity under a dynamic and finite synthesis, a reflection, an analogical reflection of God's simplicity and unity there above, in the harmony of being and consciousness here below. So if then I were to attempt to sum up the pre-modern understanding of the soul that I'm working towards in my book in a single gnomic formula, or which is precisely what I'm about to do, so I really don't need to be quite so subjunctive about it. Let me say, in order to attempt to sum up the pre-modern understanding of the soul in a simple gnomic formula here, it would be this. The soul, classically understood, ultimately coincides conceptually with existence itself. It is convertible with the very act of being, or rather, there is no such thing as the act of existence apart from the act of consciousness. But again, that's at the end of a long argument, and we're at the beginning. So I'll stop there for now, and hope that's sufficient to get us going. Thanks.
Thanks very much. As I mentioned at the outset, David has indicated he would prefer and is happy to take his own questions, to field his own questions and comments. So I will turn it over to him and allow him to do so.
Paul. Thanks very much, David.
One other thing. Because not everyone knows everyone who's here, please just state your name, perhaps, if when you're making your question or comment, and where you're coming from. I mean, as an institution.
Or in your case, Paul. Just stand up and tower over everyone. That's what so.
Where I'm coming from, would that I knew. So, David, thank you. Paul Griffiths, Duke Divinity School. Thanks, David, as always, stimulating. I've got two questions, one about your opponents and the other about genealogy of the project. So the question about the opponents is that in the presentation you just gave and in the written piece you sent us, they seem without remainder to be Anglophone philosophers of mind, especially those with neuroscientific tendencies. I'd like to know what you think, if you can say in brief, about other people who think a lot about mind, for example, phenomenologists. And the reason I'm asking that is that on some understandings of that project, they ought to be opponents too, and on some other understandings, they need not be. Right. So there's a deep metaphysical question there, I think, about how you construe the phenomenological project and why they don't appear in your list of opponents. The second part is genealogical, and that's, well, let me make a recommendation or express a hope. I really hope that that Berkeley appears.
Did you just say Berkeley?
I did. I meant Berkeley.
Oh,
yes.
God.
Americanization.
Nearly had a heart attack there. Sorry.
Well, places and people exchangeable in some deep metaphysical sense, right? The bishop, I mean, Bishop Berkeley, I hope that he enters into the genealogy of your project. It seems to me that in many ways he's deeply sympathetic and profoundly important for it, especially given his own particular location in time and place. So those are the questions.
Okay, thanks. As for Anglophone philosophers and their close alliance with neuroscientific models of mind, it's true, I'm beginning where I am in the English-speaking world. My own tendencies, in fact, a great deal of the project in its developed form draws a great deal from phenomenological tradition, from Husserl, especially from Jean-François Courtine and various French phenomenologists. You're right, in some ways, they could be opponents, but what in general one doesn't have to worry about there is a set of very hard and fast prejudices about a mechanistic model of what the mind is. I mean, the issues are quite different. And the assumption that the model for philosophically veridical speech is something that can be inductively verified by the methods of what we recognize as modern physical sciences. I mean, the Anglophone philosophers tend to be the most difficult to deal with regarding these questions because it's there, for instance, that you can find persons with absolute earnestness, total purity of conscience, saying that they don't even know what consciousness is, or proposing that what we mean when we speak of reflective consciousness doesn't exist because it can be reduced to discrete physical processes if we only exert ourselves hard enough. In the continental tradition, in the phenomenological tradition, I know John Milbank's in the room, so I don't want to speak too well of a transcendental critical project, but one of the great advantages of having as the father of the continental tradition in a broad sense, Kant, is at least you're starting there from the critical awareness of impossibility of simple mechanistic reduction of what the mind does. And so those problems and those prejudices don't seem to be as persistent. But if I were writing the book in a different language for a different audience, I don't know if I would start with the Anglophone philosophers, but there they are. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer. As for Berkeley, he's a very big part of the project, actually. I mean, I think Berkeley is a philosopher that's often rejected and rarely read, often dismissed, but rarely really thought along with. And he definitely fits in the genealogy of the contrary project. Berkeley's limitations are simply the limitations of his time. I mean, he lived in a period when there hadn't, and it was impossible to have a true recovery of a fully of perfectly well worked out classical and medieval systems of thought. And so he, while he's wrestling with Locke's understanding of matter, he tends to attribute it unreflectively at times to the schoolmen as well. But those are simple historical issues. As it happens, I think a whole chapter is to be devoted to him. So. Oh, dear.
Thanks enormously, David, and obviously I agree with 90% of what you're saying, but I think probably deliberately you've introduced a tension in what you're saying, that on the one hand, you're attacking modernity for undoing a kind of natural unity of mind and body achieved precisely through the soul. On the other hand, you seem, when you say provocatively you're being idealist, you're having to some degree a Kantian starting point, you're assuming precisely a modern duality of mind and body, mind and matter, mind and world, and favoring the priority of mind. Mm-hmm. You know, so I would submit that an idealist position only exists within a modern framework. And that is, by the way, I don't think Berkeley is idealist in this sense at all. Right. But German idealism is proceeding precisely out of this assumption of dualism. And of course, I totally agree with you that, you know, Descartes and Kant are much less crude that Anglo-Saxons who are trying to sort of resolve the dualism the other way, or simply leaving the dualism unresolved. But nonetheless, I still think that these Cartesian, Kantian, and idealist starting points are inherently problematic. And it's interesting that by appearing to go in that direction, you start talking about mind and really not talking about soul at all in the traditional sense, because and at one point you seem to conflate the two, because, you know, when you say soul is convertible with being, because, you know, clearly for the ancients and the medievals, it's not. God doesn't have a soul. Mind is above soul, and soul is specifically linked to motion, whether we're talking about Aristotle or about the Neoplatonists. And then, you know, in Aquinas, you know, provocatively, mind is thought is only an accident of soul. It's bound in with the fact that the soul is the form of the body and can think and so on. And now, how Aquinas blends that with Augustine is very complicated. And I do recommend Alain de Libre's Archéologie du Sujet here, where he shows with incredible brilliance the sheer subtlety of what Aquinas does with that synthesis. But I think the really important point to make is that, for me, what differentiates traditional realism, which is ultimately rooted in Plato, is that one is saying, yes, the ultimate principle is divine mind, and and our mind has some pointers to that. But we don't get back to the divine mind by making the kind of idealist move, maybe with origins in Plotinus, of kind of retreating withinwards. And in other words, we get back to divine mind by moving away from the body, and so on. On the contrary, you know, Plato, authentically read in the more theurgic line and so on, doesn't say that. In fact, you get back to divine mind by going more into the body, more into the cosmos, and more into their integration. So I think I think idealists are tempted, and this is maybe where some of these Indian things come in as well, to sort of think that we can somehow get to the point where we are really creating matter or creating the world. And, you know, the difference with the Fathers and Aquinas is that they do not think that. You know, only God has the mind that can create matter and can create the world. But then, paradoxically, our only intimation of that is to stay with the body. Because although God is pure mind, somehow he has a mind that is also the ground of matter and the body and so on, even though he's not material. And finally, and you will immediately guess what I mean by this, I think the only resolution of that is a Trinitarian metaphysics.
Now there's a surprise. So. Well, you know, the thing is, of course, you know, in principle, I agree with you anyway. Beginning
Well, I
is...
thought you might.
Yeah, but I mean, starting is difficult because even if I'm starting with Anglophone philosophy, I'm also starting with a critical project of consciousness. And it has been defined in advance, and it has to be replied to. There is a slipperiness about the way I'm using the word soul this morning because I have the happy luxury of not having to speak in Greek. So I don't, you know, I can then slip between psyche and nous. But ultimately, obviously, I'm working towards precisely the position you enunciate. I just feel that I have to do it in a plausible way from the critical and then phenomenological vantage. But you're right. When I attempt to condense it, it's going to look like I'm granting in advance the very dualism, and therefore positing an idealism that's just a reverse dualism. And you're right. This is a persistent problem in the German idealist tradition. Even in Schelling, you know, it never goes away because the problem is still one of an overcoming of a what is an irreducibly dialectical relationship. So it never truly escapes from that dualism, and I grant that up front. Ultimately, what I'm working towards, and when be very careful when you say, you know, soul is convertible, you know, that's not quite true. Well, psyche, I'll admit, you wouldn't say that that's convertible with being, although that is the condition of being open to all being. I mean, it is in some sense all things, at least in a rational soul. And obviously I should, if I were being a precise genealogist here, make a very clear distinction between, say, pneuma and psyche, or nous and psyche. I don't know how, though, as a constructive project worked out from a, I hope sincerely, but probably not, pre-theological position. I can do that without repeating the critical conditions for the argument, starting where the argument is and trying to move past them. It might, if I'm not careful, trap me in relying too heavily on models that are supposed to be dispensable. But I agree with you. And one of the reasons for emphasizing intentionality is precisely because if you think through intentionality, it's not something that's a getting beyond the body. It's precisely understanding the essential directedness of the mind as also an essential engagement in acts of physical creativity. There's a very rich way of thinking it through. But if you fear I'm going to turn into a German idealist rather than a good, wholesome, healthy Neoplatonist like you, a Christian, Trinitarian metaphysics fully in place, don't worry. If I see that as an imminent danger, I'll leap off the track altogether and hide in a ditch.
I'm really
Okay. Well, maybe that's it. Once John has spoken, Quadio on Dixit.
I'll offer. Oh, it's good. Somebody else go. Go ahead. Go ahead, Cheryl.
This is just a minor point. I think it links two different concerns. Paul's concern with phenomenology as to why...
I'm sorry, with what?
With phenomenology as to why sort of it is only friendly and neither actually nor potentially hostile to your project. And I think John's sort of genealogical point that if you are thinking of traditional metaphysics, then you can't simultaneously think of Kant. Mm-hmm. I think the two things are united. they're united in the following way, insofar as it seems to me sort of that in order to get your project going, you have to have sort of a Kant minimal and you have to have a Husserl minimal, by which I mean phenomenology as a descriptive enterprise against a natural attitude, I assume so that's a sine qua non with respect to the friendliness quotient regarding phenomenology.
Right.
On the other hand, that would not be the case, for instance, if we were dealing sort of with a 1927 or 1929 text on Cartesian meditations, which of course is the kind of provocation that other phenomenologists who are far more interested sort of in, let's say, having a non-mind-body dualism, not repeating Descartes and so forth. So everything would depend upon whether or not sort of there is any explanatory force with respect to intentionality, whereby sort of there's a way in which you begin to reintroduce or reinscribe that duality which you were supposed to overcome. So even phenomenology will have, at least sort of in terms of its history, ways of going off the track and ways of becoming dualistic again. So I take it that there's a kind of stipulation that phenomenology can only be a descriptive enterprise, or at least sort of it has to have that kind of neutrality. Secondly, I suppose that also gives a certain reading of Kant.
Yeah.
I imagine that John's objection would be that, well, Kant's transcendental unity perception can be interpreted in any number of ways. It can be interpreted, which I take as your interpretation, strictly descriptive. So the conditions of the possibility are not actually going, therefore, to be rendered as if we're talking about another cause. Of course, the idealist interpretation of Kant would, in fact, sort of translate transcendental into that. So essentially, it seems to me that I would imagine that your answer to Paul is phenomenology, and then sort of when you have phenomenology in the explanatory mode, that might not be sort of what you'd want to commit to. I think similarly with respect to Kant. The Kant that you would want sort of is a Kant that is not going to run interference, because the Kant that you would want is not an overdetermined Kant. That is, Kant already on his way to being an idealist.
Yeah, you both posed and answered your questions so comprehensively. I'm not sure what he said.
But you can reject it.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, and I would point out that that starting from where you are, and I don't even know if I'm doing that, but takes for granted that that it's possible to describe the act of consciousness in terms of its conditions, and in attempting to do that, the philosophers of early modernity were doing something inherently worthwhile, but in some ways new. I mean, give, for instance, Descartes credit for this. He foolishly accepted the mechanistic picture of nature and, in fact, gave it a more coherent description than anyone before him. But in so doing, he recognized the so-called mind-body problem emerges to view into view as a result, and precisely as such immediately calls into question the cogency of mechanism, because he recognized that it's not merely rationality as such that sets the human apart, that this is the dividing line for our reflections. He realized all at once that if the mechanistic narrative of matter is taken on as he did, I'm sorry, I know I'm not talking about phenomenology now, but I'm just making a point, that the entire affective range of consciousness also becomes unintelligible. Everything, and so it creates this picture of nature that's mechanistic through and through, inhabited by a strange and alien presence, one that doesn't even reside in animals. Well, take that for what it's worth. His conclusions are wrong. But it brings into clear relief a problem with the modern narrative that otherwise hadn't been recognized. Most of the classical articulations of phenomenology and the way certainly it's still taught in practice, quite often take it as being allied with a kind of Kantian stricture, for instance, on metaphysical conjecture. And yet, if you follow the line of method to its conclusion, it immediately seems to make that those strictures on metaphysics not only questionable but impossible to maintain. The line between the transcendental and the empirical, the line even between the immanent and the transcendent, becomes a problem for itself. What perhaps Fichte and others realized but didn't adequately work out is, for instance, Kant can talk about the structure of consciousness or structure of mind, structure of knowledge, very rarely addresses the actual act, what consciousness is as an act. Mind is an act in Aquinas, for instance, in important ways. But I mean, that's precisely what's lacking in Kant. The moment, and again, certain of the phenomenologists are very good on this, the moment you inquire what the actual dynamism of consciousness is, then the very set of limits that supposedly the critical project has identified are the very ones that it can't sustain. But I would be entirely opportunistic in this. I mean, again, and maybe John is just letting the cat out of the bag too soon. I mean, I know where I want to end, but I want to get there starting by granting, or at least seeming to grant, a very great deal of the modern project, and then from within, trying to show how it subverts itself and that the problems it creates for itself require a retreat from its assumptions altogether. Again, I don't know if that's an adequate response, but yeah. And that's right. Well, no, don't take it. There's time. Give me that. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Leopold Stubenberg. I'm a local philosopher. You were really harsh on the contemporary panpsychists, kind of made fun of them. I was wondering...
Well, yeah.
The serial argument, right?
Just a little. Just trying to get a cheap laugh. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could explain how this movement can seem so alien to you and so deeply misconceived, while you're at the same time so open. So a party member of the ancient model where matter is teleologically oriented and so forth. Sure. One way of looking at the contemporary panpsychism might be that these people, in some way or other, are maybe aiming in their own way at just the sort of thing that you like. Mm-hmm. So maybe. Well,
no, as I said, there are any number of forms of panpsychism that seem to me very appealing and very cogent, actually. And in a sense, I believe that any metaphysically traditional Christian is a kind of panpsychist, if only because all things are in the Logos and the Logos in all things. And so there is at least a divine vantage from which every modality of being is also knowledge, consciousness, the act of knowledge. But what's interesting about someone like Christoph Koch, for instance, or Giulio Tononi, or Galen Strawson, is that they're trying to be panpsychists while at the same time holding fast to a mechanistic view of matter. So the dualism is simply, the problem remains the same. How they understand consciousness and how they understand matter presents, it seems, an insuperable interaction problem. It's simply reduced to the level of the atomic. And then supposedly the question disappears because you simply posit consciousness as a universal quality. Well, what does it even mean to say that consciousness is a quality in that sense, so that it could be cumulatively measured? I mean, consciousness is an act. It has a very specific phenomenological contour. It is teleological. It does start from a sort of perspective of unity. If that's the case, and that you're still at the same time trying to preserve a mechanistic view of matter and understand things in terms of cumulative complexity and emergent properties in that sense, you haven't gotten past any of the problems of dualism, and you haven't really come any closer to dealing with how to reconcile the act of consciousness with the mechanistic picture of nature. But I quite agree with you that if we could do away with the ghost of that dualism, that panpsychism is a very appealing, in some ways, certain forms of it. Yeah. It's, again, as I say, it's trying to unite it to a mechanistic materialism, or taking that as the tacit assumption. Then it simply becomes an explanatory gesture towards vagary. You know, it's well, everything's conscious, so we don't have to worry about that.
David Schindler from the John Paul II Institute. My question, I guess, is getting at the idealism question again from a different angle, maybe. You had mentioned in your paper that you sent to us, and also in your remarks, that that there is in the divine simplicity and identity of being in spirit, and that is that seems to imply a real unity in human being between our mind and our being, at least as a kind of something to which we're aspiring. And I think all of that has to be true. My question is that my question sort of is about the sort of converse, or looking at that on the flip side. There's a unity of some kind of a unity of being and mind in human being, but there's also obviously all sorts of profound differences. A difference between the soul and the body, the mind and the soul, soul and spirit. However you articulate that, there are multiple differences, and one of our ways of experiencing that is that we can never, in fact, comprehend the whole of our being and our consciousness. There's a certain some philosophers speak of a sort of a dark ground that never comes fully to light. My question is, is all of that in human being negative? Is it all an expression of a kind of a fragmentation or a falling away, or is there something, in fact, positive in the very difference, the very inability to comprehend the whole of our being in consciousness? Is there something good about that? And if there is, and obviously the way I'm posing the question, I think that there is something positive there. Does that imply then something about the identity of being and intellect in God? Does that illuminate something about that relationship? And that then would connect to John's point about the Trinity behind this discussion.
I guess since I've always written as a theologian in the past, I'm not going to get away with not starting with the Trinity this time, ending with it, but I am going to try. Look, the point I made was simply that the presumption of the supereminent unity in God of being and knowing is an ontological premise that makes the sort of anxiety over that's created by modern dualism not a problem, all right, to begin with. But ultimately, I'm not an Advaita Vedantin of the Vivekananda sort. I don't see it as a negative. Right? Well, I know. So, to use good Thomist language here, that in fact it is for finite creatures that very synthesis, again, I don't want to use a word that sounds too German idealist either, because John's there, that analogical dynamism of the known and the unknown, of flesh and spirit, of body and spirit, of the as yet unknown and the as yet undisclosed, that is the measure of the participation, the gracious participation of a creature in God. It far from being negative, it is the way in which being is always being received as gift, as the delight of gift, as the creative and poetic labor of knowing the gift and of restoring the gift. So yeah, I mean, it is the blessedness of being a creature participating in the divine overflow of the Trinitarian love. I don't want to give the impression that I think of that as somehow an alienation from the source or estrangement. Sin is an alienation, but not finitude, certainly. Nicholas of Cusa probably forms the deep background of how I'm going to think about this, about the way in which finite instance of this union of being and knowledge enfolds and unfolds the fullness of God's act of knowing in being. And Gregory of Nyssa, too, in which that ever fuller ascent to and ascent into that unity is understood as this sort of ecstasy that's not burdened by memory, that's not burdened by the anxiety of the past, that in a sinless state it would still, however, always be the act of a finite creature disclosing the infinite through ever greater creative rejoicing therein. I don't know if I don't know if I followed your question exactly, but if that's what you mean, if it's a negative to be finite, no. It's the only way to exist, for me at least. I found it works out wonderfully.
Does that, what you said about the finite, illuminate something about the divine nature? That's sort of further, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the Trinitarian metaphysics there is only barely concealed. This requires the understanding of the act of love and knowledge in God that I'm moving towards, but actually moving out of is precisely that even the simplicity of God is the simplicity of that act. I don't think without something like the Trinitarian metaphysics that the language of participation can ever be complete. I think that metaphysics falls apart. I think the aporias, even say, that you encounter in Plotinus, are endemic to that narrative of the one and the many. And so, yeah, the very reality of how we participate in being and knowledge, it already points towards a supereminent source that can't be conceived of purely as the negation of difference, as that which is a kind of tragic simplicity as much as anything else, one that can only be aspired through as a nisus of the alone to the alone, which achieves liberation only by the negation of soul, of embodiedness.
William Desmond of Leuven and Villanova. Thank you very much, David. My question, it's a starting question. I'm assigned with Cyril O'Regan tomorrow the section on the soul and the whole, which is a fairly broad category.
It's a small territory to cover for a man of your abilities.
And some of the themes that I had in mind already have come up, and I won't talk about them, but I hope to say a few things about your title, Theistic Idealism, and talk about different kinds of idealism.
Yeah.
And perhaps with a little walk-on part by Berkeley. We Irish as Berkeley. Right. And also something about intentionality tomorrow also. But one of the questions that was coming up in the discussion about phenomenology and Kant, and also I think in discussion that moved outside of the parameters of their way of talking, is the whole question of metaphysics. I think of phenomenology as explicitly a philosophical orientation that simply says we don't do metaphysics. Mm-hmm. and we attend to things as they appear to consciousness and so on. So there is a kind of refusal, well, not necessarily a refusal, but certainly an unwillingness to do metaphysics, whatever that means. And similarly in Kant, and your own remarks about Kant indicated that as he moves along, some of these strictures become less rigid. And it's true, there is a metaphysics of morals. There's an opening to something metaphysical in the moral sphere. But I think that just how we relate to the word metaphysics is central also in what's at stake here. I mean, you could make the argument that many of the materialisms of the 19th century, 20th century are in the slipstream of a certain refusal or rejection of metaphysics, again, whatever metaphysics means. Yeah. I'm thinking of the first critique in Kant, the critique of rational psychology.
Right.
Rational psychology, that was part of the whole scholastic organization of philosophical studies. But his claim that, rational psychology just simply as an enterprise was on intellectually confused grounds.
Yeah.
So a kind of a death blow in the eyes of many to treating the soul at all within the space of rational reflection.
Yeah.
And then discussions of the Trinity, discussions of panpsychism, and so on. They move into a sphere that at least traditionally one would think of as a kind of metaphysical sphere. So I'm just kind of wondering, how and you yourself are becoming a metaphysician of sorts. You are a metaphysician of sorts.
On my good days.
On your good days,
Yeah.
but they're the best days, of course, and
Yeah.
the ones we love most. So no need to worry about that. But I wonder if you could say something about that, since your starting point is, in a sense, in the midst of things and things as they appear to us, and the richness of what, so to say, appears on the surface of things, and a kind of deconstruction of false metaphysical presuppositions that don't even understand themselves to be metaphysical presuppositions. So I'm kind of wondering, just as at the beginning of our discussions, whether something on that might be helpful.
I'm not entirely sure if I can give a perfectly satisfactory answer without trying to unfold every move in the argument I envisage, which obviously will change when it comes to writing the book. One of the great myths of modern philosophy, whether it's continental or Anglophone, is that the metaphysical epoch it consisted in all sorts of claims that were superimposed on or erected above attention to experience. And the refusal of the metaphysical in phenomenological tradition, following from the critical project of Kant, retains this fiction. The classical metaphysics is nothing but a structure of concepts that stands over against a rational cognizance of empirical experience, right? The negative cast of the way I've been approaching the argument, and again, it will work itself out in the book in ways that I perhaps haven't foreseen, is to treat English language analytic approaches to consciousness to the degree that they simply presume and try to give a theoretical basis to a kind of mechanistic picture, usually with a narrative of emergence, is to show that in their own terms they tend to fall apart, and as such point beyond themselves. Well, in a different way, the refusal of the metaphysical horizon in phenomenology has always, always proved problematic, precisely because the inherent teleology, say, of intentionality, the way it's described even by one that pretends to be prescinding most ascetically from all metaphysical claims, nonetheless subverts itself from within. I mean, again, the claim I want to make is that in either tradition, what we think of as the problem of mind is burdened by all sorts of presuppositions and what are themselves already decisions of method that are secretly decisions of metaphysics, that invariably fail to account for their own discoveries or fail to fulfill their own projects. I don't think a scrupulous phenomenology of consciousness as an act ever can come to a halt at the wall of the immanent. You know, simply we're just attending to experience, except that we find that experience is already, even in its most elementary form, you know, choosing a necktie, already an ecstasy beyond this arbitrarily defined nature or limit of empirical experience. But my engagement with all these traditions, I mean, my engagement with both continental and English language traditions in this regard is to some degree destructive. It's meant to be. But in either case, you know, and especially when you're talking about, say, someone like Husserl and what he imports from Brentano, who's, you know, quite, you know, a theologian really in all sorts of unspoken ways as well as spoken. There you have a way of attending to experience that is solvent, that does disclose things that happen in the act of consciousness that are not reducible to simple mechanistic narratives of causality, but that also will not stay within the boundaries of the strictures against metaphysics. And so in a way, I mean, I see all sorts of potentials for the project, again, breaking itself open from within. And then, if one can adequately argue that or urge it, then let's rethink altogether what it is when we mean, what it is we mean when we speak of consciousness or mind or nature or matter or the body. Is that an adequate answer? Yeah, okay, yeah. Can I get some more water? Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry, I'm drying out here. I'm on any number of medications which turn the throat into sandpaper, so forgive me if my voice is failing. Thanks. Is there,
Rob Gemello from Theology and East Asian Studies here at Notre Dame. Paul pointed out, and you acknowledged, that your opponents, your principal opponents in the project as you've outlined it so far, and also your audience, consist largely of Anglophone philosophers of mind, especially those who favor a physicalist explanation of consciousness. But it occurred to me that perhaps among Anglophone analytic philosophers, you have a few allies.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
And you mentioned in passing this morning qualia, what its likeness, and in your written introduction, you describe nature as what is found in the interval between apperceptive unity of intentional consciousness and the teleological universality of being as total intelligibility. It seems to me not accidental that someone like Thomas Nagel, who is a severe critic of the physicalist explanation of consciousness, should also be the first one, however gingerly, to revive the notion and recommend to scientists the notion of telos. And I wonder if you see in his project anything that might be of use to you in yours.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, definitely also as a very precise and agonizingly gradual critic of the presuppositions that he confronts. Actually, it's watching Nagel's almost, I mean, you can almost measure it in geological epochs, the slowness with which he's moving towards what seem to us certain inevitable conclusions. And I mean, there are others in analytic philosophy as well who are also quite interesting in this regard. I mean, even, well, for instance, I mean, John Searle is without ever arriving at what seemed to me the obvious conclusions he should arrive at, nonetheless a devastating critic of things like Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model of consciousness or computational models of mind. So I'll take whatever I can use, certainly. With Nagel, you know, you have this very interesting, maybe an example in point of someone who really does begin from his earliest work, just the question of qualitative consciousness. And by a series, and you can just follow it through his work, of very gradual, precise, small but decisive steps, moving towards a teleology of nature and of mind. As if slowly discovering that the rationality of certain antique metaphysical models is not simply a conceptual structure imposed on experience, but that arises from even the humblest and most immediately available sort of empirical experience. And I don't know, I mean, again, as I say, I know exactly where I think he's going to end up if he lives long enough. I wish it weren't such a slow, I mean, there's a great virtue in it. He never makes any extravagant conjectures. But sometimes it's like, couldn't you just do a crib of some of the stuff that's already been written for centuries and move a little more quickly towards the conclusion? So.
But, you know, the only Nixon go to Beijing principle might be.
Right, yeah, only Nixon could go to Beijing, and only Thomas Nagel can give us a teleology of nature. Although, I mean, the way he was savaged by the true believers for his last book is an indication that certain dogmatic decisions are never going to be abandoned by the faithful. So, so is that? Are we at? No, Chris. Sorry.
Christopher Simpson, Lincoln Christian University. I'm just curious as to where you would locate Spinoza relative to your...
Do I have to?
Yeah.
Do I have to locate him anywhere?
Well, we've been talking about all the other good early modern philosophers, but it seemed to be, perhaps as a, maybe resonances with your project, maybe a counter case to your project, or at least or precursor to German idealism.
You know, depending on how Spinoza's read, of course, there you don't have a dualism. You have a sort of infinitized occasionalism, right? There's that really putatively in God, there are an infinite number of modalities, but they can only be parallel rather than different ways in which the finite, under the aspect of plurality, mirrors the unity and simplicity of the divine. Rather, those modalities are themselves sort of absolute differences by which the divine expresses itself outward and inward. So, I mean, as a metaphysics, if that's how you read Spinoza, it just seems to me to take all the problems inherent in a dualism and multiply them by infinity. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously, you can read it in a very German idealist way as well. I don't know, I've never been able to make sense of any metaphysics or any ontology that won't acknowledge the analogical disjunction within continuity between the divine and between the transcendent and the immanent. Because not to do so not only might evacuate all metaphysical conjecture of any ultimate explanatory value, but it merely seems to project the in raising, and of course, it's the great German of drama, the great drama of German idealism is importing the anxiety and stress and difficulty of finite experience into the context of the infinite. But in so doing, you arrive with a mythology rather than a metaphysics that seems, at the end of the day, logically cogent. And that's always how I felt about Spinoza, but I don't think he appears anywhere in my project, except, maybe I'll make a rude remark or two, again, for a cheap laugh. I don't know, why do you have a particular...
Well, something like his metaphysical proposal is standing behind many continental counter cases of Trinitarian metaphysics, usually by way of Deleuze.
Yeah, I mean, I know the sort of, and there you have the kind of upended Platonism in which you talk vacuously about original difference. Again, it's appealing if you're trying to provoke, but I just find, and here I'm just being simple-minded about it, the logical solvency of it obviously isn't there, because the fundamental problem of the unity of experience, the unity of being experienced, or the fundamental problem of simply that an ontology in which things actually are in relation to one another resolves to a first principle. That just seems to me a logical inevitability. So that sort of romance of the endless strife of difference seems to me pictorially engaging, but not a philosophical possibility worth considering for more than 10 minutes. Sorry.
David, there's lots of great stuff to come later. I've got a methodological question, I suppose, again. Your project's framed as an argumentative one.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what degree of confidence you have in argument. What I mean by that is, clearly you don't expect, at least I take it you don't expect, Daniel Dennett to read this book and nod sagely and say, "Oh yes, now I see."
Oh, yes, I do.
Oh, you do?
Well, no. If that happened, then I would toss the book away, knowing that I'd made some colossal error.
So then the question is who is a book like this for? Is it to provide conceptual devices and tools and vocabulary, lexicon, etc., to those who are already close to the position that you want to enunciate and defend, but just need more articulacy about it than they've got? Or is it actually a polemical engagement with those who are in almost every respect at odds with your position, and you actually want to try and convince them? Or is it something else again?
Yeah, we've got 2 minutes here, so let me... I'm no stranger to polemic, obviously. This book will not be quite as polemical as perhaps it might seem from starting from the critical disagreements with the modern tendencies or current tendencies in philosophy of mind. I don't know about an audience. I'm just trying to think through the ways in which it seems to me modern philosophies of mind, modern philosophies of consciousness seem with a kind of shocking predictability to fail, and to avoid the problems they raise simply by reinscribing them with different descriptions that don't actually solve the problem, but simply come up with a new vocabulary for them. And the ways in which it seems, it's just thinking through for myself, the ways in which the persistence of these problems might naturally yield a retreat to a different metaphysical picture, one that after the, in the aftermath of certain modern projects might turn out to have been a much better systematic approach to the difficulties of experience, the problems of common experience. I don't expect to convince Daniel Dennett. I believe you can convince people who are uncertain about a great number of questions to reconsider the solvency of ancient and medieval models or other models of understanding the relation of mind and world. I think one thing I've learned, though, in recent years, specifically in dealing with people like Daniel Dennett, is it's impossible to underestimate just how ferocious the dogmatic commitment to a mechanistic picture of the physical is. I mean, to the point that eliminativism is not rejected out from the beginning, but is kept in reserve as a kind of nuclear option for those. If we can't come up with a plausible emergentist account of consciousness, then rather than allow what seems quite evident experience of consciousness to recast our thinking, we're simply going to have to go for the final. Our final response is simply going to have to be a straightforward, entirely unironic claim that consciousness doesn't exist at all. And even in the simple, phenomenal qualitative sense, does not exist at all. And at that point, it's just you're obviously dealing with a kind of fundamentalism, and it would be foolish to try to convince.
Friends, we've reached the end of our time this morning. Unbelievable as it is, it's gone by very quickly. But before we end our time today, I want to thank, first of all of those who raised questions and comments, helped to probe the many issues that are involved in the study of consciousness, and to help launch in a most excellent manner the 2 days that we'll be spending together. We also like to thank all of those who came out this morning who participated and haven't yet raised their questions. And finally, without any further ado, let's give a big round of our appreciation to Professor David Hart.